Hello, I'm Hilton Super, the Vice Chairman of Studium Group. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking to Tobias Dengel, the president of WillowTree and author of a very interesting book called The Sound of the Future, The Coming Age of Voice Technology. So this is where we interview people who are changing the world, people that are inspiring us with their achievements and creativity and acumen with the use of technology. Now, in previous interviews, we have interviewed over 300 amazing people and achieved more than 15 million views on YouTube. Now, this interview series on Cities ABC is in partnership with our platforms, openbusinesscouncil.org, which is a Web3 fourth industrial revolution-based platform utilizing technologies that incorporate digital identity using blockchain and the deployment of data analytics, AI, and machine learning. Now, today I'd like to introduce you to Tobias, who is the president of WillowTree and wrote a fantastic book, The Coming Age of Voice Technology. So welcome, Tobias. Where are you?
Hi, Hilton. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Brilliant. So you've been coming to the end of a nice long summer. How's it been for you?
Well, the summer has been, as crazy as it sounds, it's been surprisingly cool in this part of the world. I know the rest of the world, it's been a hot summer, but all the weather patterns are shifting around. So we've had a mild summer so far, and excited to get everybody back in the office and kids back to school.
Brilliant. So tell me a little bit about, you've always been in that area. Where did you go to school, and tell us a little bit about your, where you grew up?
Yeah, so I'm a first-generation American. My parents emigrated from Germany in the 1960s. My father was a physicist and got recruited to work for the U.S. Navy after he got his PhD in Munich, and my mother was a physician. So I think I grew up like a lot of first-generation Americans, split between two cultures. My whole family was in Germany. We spoke German at home. Today, I think people would call it giving your kids grit. I don't know that my parents would call it that, but they did things like send me to school in lederhosen and not really teach me English till I got to kindergarten. And so it built a certain resilience in me from early days. And then as I progressed through school, as my this is of course very German. My father told me, look, I'm only going to pay for university if you study something proper. And proper in his mind was either hard sciences or at least engineering. I was interested in that, but I was also super interested in business because I graduated from high school in 1989. That was the time in the late 80s where people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were changing the world and were all of a sudden out of nowhere creating these companies. So that was my inspiration. And I found a program at the University of Pennsylvania that was a dual degree program between business and technology. It's called Management and Technology. And that's what I wanted to do at starting in 10th or 11th grade in high school. I was like, I want to spend my life working at this nexus of technology and business.
And then after that, you move forward towards Wharton.
Well, so it was actually a 5-year program. It was a concurrent engineering and Wharton program. And then coming out of that, I went into management consulting for 2 years at A.T. Kearney. I would recommend a management consulting track for certainly a couple of years to almost anyone, unless you happen to be Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or Zuckerberg or someone like that who's just dropping out of school to, if you're in that dimension, sure. But for the rest of us, spending 2 years in management consulting, I think is about as good of an education in business as you can possibly get. And I got extraordinary exposure to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And I met my first mentor, my most important mentor in some ways, a guy by the name of Johan Orrick, was the first principal on my first project. We were working for Federal Express, and he later became the global managing director, CEO of A.T. Kearney, and has been a mentor my whole career. So That 2 years, even though it was short, had an extraordinary impact on my life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as a management consultant, the best ones are the ones that listen.
Yeah. Yeah. You listen a lot, you synthesize, you learn how to present, you learn how to, especially as a young person, deal with people who are decades older than you and get their confidence. So it's not easy, right? You're traveling all the time. You're in very uncomfortable positions. I remember a story that we were trying to improve the rate at which folks were loading packages for Federal Express, and I was told that I was completely delusional in terms of how fast people could load. And I challenged one of the Federal Express employees, and we went head to head for 2 hours one night loading packages. But it's those kinds of things that you got to get into the front lines and the weeds to make change, I think.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, because people are stuck in processes that's sort of learned through a very linear process, and it's nice to have somebody that can challenge it and say, okay, isn't there a better way of doing it?
Yeah, and that what's interesting is that translation of theory to practice, I think, is where so much value gets created. One of my favorite quotes is Yogi Berra, who said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And you just see that all the time, right? Theory is one thing, you can talk about it, but you got to get it, and I think business is so exciting because unlike academia, you're in practice all the time. You have a scoreboard every day.
So your earlier roles were with companies like Leads.com and AOL. Tell us a little bit about that.
So it's a good story. I was 2 years after Kearney, which is a standard analyst program, and I was going to go to INSEAD for a year outside of Paris. And I was on a plane, and back then, the way you found jobs was you looked at the classifieds, and I was looking at the Wall Street Journal, and there was a classified ad for analysts to join AOL. For those of listening who don't know what AOL is, it was at the time the dominant way to access the internet in the United States and a lot of European countries. And it was a lot like working at Google or Meta would be today. You were kind of in the center of the action. And I applied for that job and got it and decided, that's the job I want after going to INSEAD, and I've got it now, so I'm going to go. And it was just an extraordinary time. Every company that was raising money had to get their deal done with the AOL. So I was working on the deal side. I got to know extraordinary people. I, did the first deal with the NBA that got the NBA online, and I met a young lawyer there named Adam Silver, who's now the commissioner of the NBA, and we're still close. And so it was just an extraordinary opportunity to meet senior leaders across all sorts of different industries.
I mean, the thing is, you make some amazing connections. I mean, you talked originally about your mentor and then meeting various people along the way, which have helped you shape your direction in your career and direction in your life.
Yeah, I think, you meet so many people and you don't know. Yeah, we might meet someone who's very famous, et cetera, that when you're especially junior are hard relationships to build. But if you build a lot of relationships at your level, and maintain them, there are going to be some super interesting people over the coming decades to be in touch with. And I've always just felt very natural about that. People talk about quote unquote networking. I kind of find that superficial and annoying, and people being on LinkedIn and reaching out to you. That's not a relationship. A relationship is built upon having done something together, having done some work together, having built something together. But the folks that I have done those things with, I've really tried to stay in touch with for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. And then you started working at, obviously there was Leads.com, but then Web.com. What a fantastic URL that is.
Yeah. So there's some good stories there. So I was at AOL for 7 years, and then at that time, digital search for local businesses, which had been in the Yellow Pages for 50 years. And it's hard to remember now, but there was more money, advertising money spent in the United States on Yellow Pages every year than were spent on radio and magazine advertising combined. It was just a huge industry because every consumer who wanted to find a local business had to basically pick up the Yellow Pages. And it moved online very rapidly over 3 or 4 years, from maybe 2000 to 2003, 2004. And we saw that trend developing at AOL. And I was the general manager of AOL Local, which included the AOL Yellow Pages. And so we wanted to do a deal with Yahoo and Google to package all that up and go to small business and say, hey, we'll get you online for a subscription. Pay us $200 a month. We'll get a little website and we'll do all your online marketing. We couldn't get that done at AOL. So a partner and I left AOL to start Leads.com in 2003 to basically do exactly that business, is aggregate online advertising for small businesses. And we had outbound, call centers that said, hey, Mr. Plumber, guess what? People are using Google to find plumbers. You gotta be on Google. Give us your credit card. We'll charge you $200 a month. And it worked super well because all of a sudden their phone started ringing, so they didn't cancel. We started that company was first called Lead Logic. And my partner and I said, you know what? We need a better brand. Let's find let's get Leads.com. And that was owned by a guy out in California who was selling a little piece of software to track criminal leads to police departments. And so we made him an offer. And, this was 2003, 2004. We agreed on $250,000, which is a lot of money at the time. Mm-hmm. And a day from signing, he came back and said, you know what? I talked to some folks. They think I should get $500,000. And then we looked at each other and said, all right, we'll do it. And then he came back again and said, I need $750,000. We finally did it for $750,000, which was, we'd only raised $2 million. So we spent almost all our money on that URL, but it was such a powerful URL. Mm. Then 2 years later, we were acquired by Web.com. And that's an interesting story. That URL, Web.com, a guy in Texas bought in like 1996 or 97 because his initials were WEB.
No.
And he bought that URL, and I think 4 or 5 years later, he sold it for north of $10 million.
Wow. Brilliant. Yeah. But just going back to the AOL days, I know the rise and the, not say the fall or demise of AOL, but it was America Online, which was basically, search engine, and also connecting as well. But where, just from a management consulting hat, what was the trajectory or the wrong trajectory, or did the market change on the business?
So what was going on is AOL was a narrowband service. So you had to use your computer modem to dial up into, for those of us who remember, it made all kind of crazy sounds and connected you, and it was super slow. Broadband was coming, and it was coming in 2 platforms that still exist today, DSL, with your phone line, or cable modems. And that was clear as day. Everyone knew that. AOL had a strategy that we would work with the DSL and the broadband providers, that we would switch our clients who are paying usually about, mid-20s, low $20s per month for a subscription. We would switch them to broadband on it could be Verizon, or it could be, a cable company. And that would cost about $45 a month. AOL would get about $15 to $20 a month of that and still retain the whole front-end experience. And then the cable or the DSL provider would get the rest of the money in exchange for providing the connectivity. So it was a great strategy, and it was working. And then we did the Time Warner deal, which the idea there was to create this entire integrated media entity, which people have tried to do again and again and again over the last 20 years. That almost every single time has failed. Most recently, when AT&T bought again, Yahoo and AOL, and then had to spin them off again. What happened was when we did that deal, all the DSL, the phone companies said, well, now you're part of a cable company. Time Warner had the largest cable company in the United States, and said, you know what? We're not dealing with a cable company because you're our competition now. Then the other cable companies weren't big fans of Time Warner Cable, and so they kind of started pulling out of our deals. And then the worst of all was Time Warner Cable had a service called Roadrunner that they continued to perpetuate and not put AOL on top. So the deal that was supposed to solve broadband for us actually ended up killing broadband for us. And so what ultimately happened is, as consumers went to broadband, one by one, they canceled narrowband, and there was no reason to have an AOL relationship anymore. But it's a really interesting case study in unintended consequences and kind of not maybe having fully thought through the consequences of a transaction like that.
I mean, also there was the drive for tying up with content, because the content was key and the key driver, and it was controlled content, which was, as we now know, content is, you can get on your mobile phone from Netflix or whatever. That was the change.
And that strategy has continued. I mean, AT&T tried to do it again recently with AOL and Verizon, and this whole HBO deal where AT&T tried to have, because it never works, right? If you're HBO, you want everyone to get your content. If you're the channel, the distribution partner, you want exclusive content. And so that those models have proven to be incredibly difficult to make happen.
And so we moved to where you are today at WillowTree. So what was the genesis and the motivations in 2010 to put WillowTree together?
Yeah, so I had done, we'd sold leads.com to web.com and had a wonderful relationship with the leadership there. But they were based in Jacksonville, Florida. And I had moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is, because my wife she's a physician, was doing her residency here. And I was on the road every day of the week, basically, either going to headquarters in Jacksonville. This was back when everyone got together most of the time, if you were on an executive team, or to see clients. And then we had kids, and I couldn't be on the road 5 days a week anymore. So I took a year. And that was right when Steve Jobs opened up the iPhone to developers. And I immediately saw this is going to be a very, very big deal and a very big opportunity. I met a guy here in Charlottesville, Virginia, who had built the first ticketing iPhone app in the App Store. And I talked to him about, well, why don't we? I asked him. I said, "Hey, his name was Michael Pritchard. Hey, Michael, how do you make money when you're working on this ticketing app?" He said, "Well, I put ads up on the internet, on Google, that say app developer for hire, and I get so many calls. I literally have to shut the ad down in a couple hours." This is 2009, 2000, where we were in a recession. And I said, I know a lot about online marketing. If we team up, we could really make a business of this. And he was reluctant because he didn't want to be in a services business so much. He wanted to be in his own app and product business. But 6 months later, I saw him again, and we decided to team up. And that was, late 2009. We started 2010 with 3 employees. It was a banner year for us. We ended with 7 employees. And we were, off to the races. And I had a lot of relationships from my AOL days with executives, and we would call them up and say, "Hey, we're building apps." And it was at a time when apps were considered very niche, and most, all of a sudden, every company wanted an app, but they didn't trust Accenture or Deloitte or Cognizant or IBM to build it for them. They wanted an app specialist. And so we were able to get many of those projects and then build relationships, and then over time offer those companies much more than just mobile apps.
Mm-hmm. So you go beyond that, which leads to the fact that obviously when you're dealing with app, it's very engaging. It's very touch. It's very you are very engaged because it's your mobile device, and that's the nature of applications that are being used. but then suddenly you start saying, okay, is there a better way to do this? And then came the voice first. So tell us a little bit about that.
So we have always been asked by our clients, what's next, right? Mobile in its current form started 2008, 2009. It seems like every decade or so, there's a big change, like going to PCs hit in the 80s and the internet in the 90s, then mobile came. And we're a little long in the tooth at this point on what's next. And there have been a lot of false starts, right? If you look, if you were at CES in 2013, you would have heard that by, within 5 years, 90% of households in America are going to have a 3D television. No one has a 3D television. In 2016, 17, with Google Glass, et cetera, everyone, we're all going to have these AR and VR experiences, very small penetration. And so we constantly get asked what's next, and we look at all the technologies that are coming out, and we started really diving into voice around, we've always been working with Siri because it's been part of the app ecosystem since 2011 and 12, but it hasn't been very open, but we're obviously very aware of it. But then Alexa came out and had this enormous penetration very quick. And we were asking ourselves, like, what's going on here? Like, why do people want this? And there wasn't a lot of work that had been done around the why. And we kind of dived in, and it quickly became apparent that, like most user interfaces, all of us want speed, right? One of my favorite stats is for every second that an app, is delayed in loading, you lose about 20 to 30% of the audience, right? People just have zero patience. Everything's about speed. And the reality is we can speak 3 times as fast as we can type. So since the dawn of the computing age, we've been using keyboards to enter information, and all of a sudden, holy crap, there's a way to do it 3 times as fast. And so that was the breakthrough moment for us. But then we're like, but why is it, if that's the case and it's so much better, why isn't everything going to voice overnight? The problem is that the reverse is not true. We actually can read much more quickly than we can listen. And so we all experience this in our lives, right? We all want to dictate messages, text messages to our friends or even emails, but we don't want to listen to messages. We don't want to listen to voicemails. We want to look at the transcription because it's so much faster. And so the breakthrough moment for us was saying, you know what? It's an incredible interface to transmit information. It's a poor interface to receive information. And so that's why it's all hung up right now, because the initial designers, and it's very common with any new tech, they're applying old tech and old thinking to the new tech. They designed it as a conversational replacement, voice to voice. And that really doesn't take advantage of it. And so the breakthrough moment was what we really need. What we need is multimodal, where we need to be speaking commands. We need to tell, and the example I always use, if you want to go to the movies tonight, it's so easy. You want to say, hey, what movies are playing to your app? But you don't want to listen to your app repeat all the movies and the show times. That's movie phone that was around 20 years ago. You just want to look at a list of movies and then say, all right, get me Star Wars at 8 p.m. And then the app does it. And that's what we think is the future, and we're on the cusp of it. And we're starting to see it in big ways right now in certain banking apps. Waze does it pretty well. Spotify does it. But I think that the world that we're going to is in a year or two, virtually every app will have a mic button, and you'll be telling your app what you want to do. You'll be telling your app, change my flight, book a flight, change my seat. It's just so much more efficient than typing and or swiping, tapping, et cetera.
But there's a challenge with that, is that as we know, with Siri and Alexa, the more you engage with them, you basically, as generative, you're actually educating it on what your personal preferences are and what are your current situation. But with those type of platforms, people don't want to engage because they know that they don't own that data.
Yeah. So I think one of the constraints has been this question of trust. And I think this is where these voice platforms have made, I think, two kind of fundamental errors. One is the point you're making, Hilton, that the data, and this is well documented, that Amazon and others were just listening to everything going on in your household, and that it's going to take a while to recover from that. And that was just a complete miss in terms of how they thought about it. The second piece of trust is really interesting, and we've been studying it a lot. And it's another reason why humans don't want to listen to machines. There's been this whole push, like, how human can we make Siri or Alexa in their responses? And there's this concept called the uncanny valley that was developed in the 1970s in Japan, that basically posits that the more human-like an experience is, but not human, the more freaked out the user gets, right? And there's all kinds of theories. It's because it might be a zombie, it might be a dead person. It's just too close to human, but clearly not human. And so making these voice experiences more and more human actually reduce human trust in Siri and Alexa, because they know they're not human. And so it's another reason that I think the multimodal response is so powerful, because if humans are judging the response as coming from a computer, they have a completely different standard than if they think it's from a human. And so I think on two dimensions, the trust equation has been violated early in the development of voice. That's going to take longer to overcome than it might otherwise have.
And that is a sort of a nice way of putting it in perspective, is the preference of the engagement and the perception of human-like reactions. And the reactions are cute, smart, fast, coming back at you. You feel threatened.
Yeah.
By that. So that's a bit of a challenge. But in terms of the apps that you're building now, or the technologies that you're building for your clients, you obviously have implemented that in your platforms. What are the challenges that you are having in terms of the bandwidth of the technology in order to do that?
Yeah, so I think that a couple things have literally happened over the last 12 or 18 months that have accelerated, will continue to accelerate the voice adoption. So one is that a lot of the computing of the natural language processing, in other words, transcription is what that is really, is understanding what you just said, has moved from being in the cloud and hence delayed to on device. And so it's much faster and it's gotten much better. It still has a ways to go. If you have a strong accent, my father's a very thick German accent, it does a very poor job with him. But I think we all recognize that it's made extraordinary moves forward over the last 3-4 years, 5 years, and will continue to. And so step one in any voice experience is, can I even transcribe what you're saying? That's natural language processing. Step two is natural language understanding. Does it know what you mean? So one of the most interesting stats is that Google, through their Google Home Assistant, they've discovered that in English, there's over 2,500 ways that people set an alarm, right? And what's more simple than that? And so the processing of taking a transcribed series of words and turning it into an intent is natural language understanding. And that is where generative AI is playing an extraordinary role right now in how that gets done. Because for most of the last 20 years, people have tried to use hard coding to say, all right, Hilton said, set an alarm for 8 a.m., that means that then turns into a command, a series of commands that happen. That's all been hard coded, right? And so because there's so many edge cases in terms of how people set their alarm, it's really, really hard to do and falls apart. And that's where these large language models solve that problem, because they've basically taken just an extraordinary amount of data, human speech, and basically figured out what the intent is. And so that's the second breakthrough that's happening right now that I think is super important, is going to accelerate it. And then the third is, and this is always the hardest, is user acceptance, user expectations, et cetera, that they feel they have to have trust that when they say things, and this is to some extent a user experience issue, when they say things to an app, the app's actually understanding what they're saying. And so there's a lot of tricks to that. So for example, we found that a user is about twice as likely to trust that an app understands what it's saying if there's live transcription going on while they're talking to it, because they know the words are at least being transmitted. So we were working with a fast food place, and we were using a mic button to, order your burger, order your fries. And they knew it was faster, but they didn't have a lot of trust when we just added a simple thing that as they were speaking, it was highlighting what they were saying and in a real-time basis, showing what they were ordering on a menu in the background. Trust went up, by a factor of 2. And so the user experience piece is really, really important in any new technology.
And the engagement of the content that you produce in these new technologies, your voice, your commands, the way you do it, your style, your approach in terms of how you engage with these technologies, that data is effectively becomes the domain of the person who owns that domain, and they can use it to provide utility to yourself. But it's not your data anymore. How have you dealt with that? Yeah.
So I think there's a couple different approaches. What we encourage our clients is A, transparency is key, right? And B, anonymity is key, right? Most users, if you tell them, hey, we're going to use your data, we're going to tie it to an ID that isn't trackable in any of our systems to know that this is Hilton. All it is this is a person, and we've optimized the data for him. Any data that we optimize the system as a whole is not even trackable to that ID. People get much more comfortable if they feel like, hey, if someone cracks into the system and they can search everything that Hilton has ever asked, that's not good. And no one wants that. And I think making sure that the systems are set up that way and organized that way, which is possible. It costs more. It's an effort, but I think it's the only way forward. And I think the EU in particular is legislating these kinds of approaches, and because of that, the rest of the world is going to follow.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that you talk about in the book is you talk about the voice technology gap, which, is bridged by devices and human emotions. Can you just explain a bit how with the voice technology, the human emotion and voice can be captured through the technology?
Yeah. So the concept here is that the emotional state, the state of agitation or joy or whatever it is of someone speaking into the device, right? And there's some cultural differences, but generally speaking, human beings are very good at judging if someone is frustrated, angry, tired, etc., and using that information to enhance the end customer experience is is a really important opportunity, right? So if you're and using other contexts as well. So if your flight is delayed or canceled, and you're on your family vacation, and you can kind of sense the mounting frustration of someone speaking to the device, you might short circuit the whole system and put them in direct touch with a human in that example, versus letting them continuously go through the system. And so it's making making it a much more human experience, versus just zeros and ones and trying to analyze. All right, someone's trying to change their flight. That's, depending on their state of mind and their situation, it might be quite a different response that you'd want to give them.
No, because I've had experiences of working with generative AI chatbot, and with voice activated one as well, which we've been working on ourselves. And it doesn't capture that emotional thing yet. It's going to take a while for that emotional, it just transcribes what I say, but not in the way that I say it.
Exactly. Yeah. And some of that is, there are cultural differences, right? It's a funny thing when you give surveys to end users in different countries, the baseline you get back are quite different. I can say this because I'm German, but when we used to do a lot of work for HBO, the ratings and response for a similar experience in Germany might be 2 points out of 10 lower than in the United States. But that doesn't mean it was worse. It's just the baseline of their evaluation is going to be lower. So the frustration or the excitement that is common in different cultures and even amongst different people in those cultures is important. And that's one of the reasons it's going to take a while to really work through.
Because that sort of emotional understanding is quite important as we move from, with the new technologies, into augmented reality and virtuality and even avatars or digital twins. Because if you look at avatars now, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say voice is a centerpiece of that, right? Because the metaverse doesn't exist without voice, because you're not going to be in the metaverse using your keyboard, right? It has to be a visual experience that's primarily voice powered. And for the most part, those experiences don't have a camera on your face, so they don't have a way to judge your emotion visually. The only kind of input on emotion they're going to have is voice. So that field is going to evolve very, very quickly and rapidly, and I feel it's going to be a similar breakthrough as we saw with ChatGPT in kind of language. We're going to have a similar breakthrough in emotion, because they're going to use the exact same approach of just putting an extraordinary amount of data into the system, and tagging it. And then the system is going to learn different emotions, and then it's going to be able to assign, to judge those emotions by all sorts of metrics that might include location, nationality, history for that particular person, et cetera, et cetera. Again, anonymized, but I'm a pretty calm person, so when I get agitated, it's a really big deal, and the system should know that. Versus, my partner here, Mike, he gets, his voice will go up more quickly than mine, and so the system might have a different level of sensitivity by history per person, right?
So, but that doesn't require the system to know it's you.
It doesn't require, it just requires it to know it's ID, blah, 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 blah.
ID, whatever. Okay.
Yes. And that key, that's the key to everything, right? Is making sure that that's not traceable to a human being, so that a hacker, or, if you're a well-known person, someone can't crack in and kind of get the history of your emotions. And it's just, that is a prerequisite to all of this happening, is that kind of anonymity.
Because that's very interesting, whereby, you're getting people doing deep fakes and faking other people and creating a different script and then voice activating it with technology to sound like that person, look like that person. But with voice today and the developments today, do you think the technology is able to detect if that voice belongs to a real person or not?
So right now there's a lot of work being done on deep fake detection. And I think there's currently some very effective algorithms that look at a voice profile and can tell if it's a deep fake or not, because they're just some telltale signs of how the deep fake software works. But it's a never-ending arms race. So what I always tell people is the voice authentication, as an example, it's a tool. It's a biometric tool, but the safest mechanic is two-factor or multi-factor, right? I think when you look at banking software that we're working on with banks, they're looking at multiple factors. They're saying, all right, is it the device that this person has typically used? Is it their voice? Is it two-factor? Now we've sent them a code. Is the pattern of what they're doing in line of normal patterns? And so they're, that's the arms race, right? It's not ever going to be one solution. It's the fact that if you've got 4 or 5 layers of defense, it's extraordinarily difficult to crack.
And as regulation drives the industry to be compliant with various data protection policies and laws, would you ever see a day when we have ownership of our data, ownership of our content, which is naturally our voice, and can monetize that?
Yeah. There have been some startups in that space. I think the hardest part of that is getting human beings to actually motivate to do anything with it. I think, the cookie legislation is a good example. Now you go to any website and you get this pop-up around cookies, which is a really well-intentioned experience. Like basically you control your data. What do you want us to do with your cookies? And people just don't want this. They're like, get rid of that. I don't care. I'm moving on. For the most part. I mean, there's 10% of the population that takes this stuff seriously and says, all right, for this website, I'm going to give them these cookies and I'll go through it. And it's only the cookies that impact performance, and it has to be anonymized. But by and large, I think humans, especially the younger generations, have not shown that they are especially motivated to put the time in to manage their own data in that way. So theoretically, I think it's a great idea. Practically, I haven't seen it implemented in a way that makes it easy enough that large parts of the population would say, all right, I'm claiming my data and I'll get paid, $3 a month, whatever it is, to share that data with this provider so that they can make my experience better.
But if you think about the whole cookie example, and you and I have significant experience of actually going through that process, whereby it's incredibly, the UI UX and the way you navigate through the choices is exceptionally complicated and lengthy. Then I can understand why people get bored.
Yeah, probably intentionally so, if you want to take
exactly the
critical view of some of these providers, right?
The incentivization's on the wrong side of the equation.
Yeah,
it's the incentive to the provider of the service who wants your data, who's making it difficult for you to restrict their access to your data.
Yeah. I think the question is there an economic incentive system that you can create that switches that up? Because it's going to be really hard to do it through ongoing legislation where you say, all right, now this is the UI that has to be, it's a cat and mouse game that you can never win.
Yes.
It all has to eventually come down to, is there a completely different mechanic on? Mm-hmm. And people, so email, right? We get so much spam. There's been all this, like if we could reverse the incentives that it costs money to send an email, or you would get paid to receive emails. Are there ways to switch these incentives? But very difficult to do.
Yeah. I mean, and this goes back to one of the earlier things you said, is email will never, or some form of messaging will never die. I mean, we all, to us, it's completely normal to write something to somebody.
Yeah.
Okay. And it goes back to what you were saying before, is yes, I can dictate to my computer what I want to say, but I've got so used to the pace of my typing and the rhythm that my thought processes and putting my thoughts on paper are aligned. I do use voice to activate, and I can do it on my mobile phone or on my computer, but it's clunky.
Yeah. And I think it's a paradigm shift, right? And so when I look at the next generation, my kids who span from 11 to 16, they use voice for everything, right? They'll dictate their papers, and they've learned, there's tool sets, et cetera. I think it's analogous probably to what our parents or maybe even grandparents went through when things moved from the typewriter to the personal computer.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them never really adopted the new mechanic. And I think part of it was because there were just new tools you had to use. You had to learn how to, do something in bold that was different, or underline, or whatever it was. And I think kids are just intuitively getting that, right? They can manipulate a document on a page. Word now has a voice command system that we don't know. I don't know how to do, right? The reason I still type is not so much because of the words. It's because I can't control like the paragraphs or like the period. Like it's just, I don't know how to do it in a way that's as efficient as typing for me. Mm-hmm. But I watch them and I'm like, oh my God, they know how to do it.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, in a way, you want to educate the system in such a way that you just speak what you want to say, and it knows when to do paragraph. It knows how to reformat. It knows to put in the punctuation. It just has learned.
100%. And that's why I think this marriage of conversational AI or voice and Gen AI is the magic, right? Because ChatGPT can do it on its own. And now a real-time voice informed version of that is going to be where the real magic is.
Exactly. So looking forward in terms of the growth and development of voice in technology, where do you see the quickest adoption of that?
So, yeah, so it's in, we don't look at there as much in industries, but in jobs or in actions that are very, very keyboard heavy right now. And so it could be anything. I mean, one of my favorite examples, right, is if you're in a restaurant right now, like, and this is changing. McDonald's is putting in voice kiosks as we speak, but the kind of insanity of it all is I give an order with my voice to someone, and that human being interprets it and then types it into a computer, right? And so it's a 2-hop process that really should be a 1-hop process, because as soon as I say it, the information is out there in the universe. Mm-hmm. And any place that is happening where people are saying things or people are typing information, that those are going to be the first to change. The other thing is things where this is really interesting, is long tail searches. So if you have to enter a fair amount of information in order to find something. So a good example is we work with a large beverage distribution company, one of the 2 largest in the world. And they have 10,000 people in the United States who just fix machines, whether it's, dispensers in bars and restaurants or soda machines. And they have over 100,000 parts for all those different machines. And so if you're out in the field today and, up until 5 years ago, you had paper catalogs, then now you're typing things, but you go back to your truck, you type it into a laptop, and it takes a very long time. Whereas if you're just using your voice, you can enter all that information because these parts are complicated and long, and you can get an instant response. It accelerates the process so much more because you don't want to be typing that on your phone, especially. So these long tail searches where you have to enter a fair amount of information to find a result is another example of something that's going to happen quickly. The third one I would just say is anything with that in the industry they're calling eyes up, hands on. So you're working with both hands, your eyes are up, and today you have to take your hands off of whatever you're doing to type something in. So it's warehouse work, retail work. If you're you're a retailer helping a customer find something, police work, those kinds of things. But there's a whole category. Field services. If we're working a lot with companies that have they're doing installations or repair out in the field. That folks are working and they need information. They need to order something. They need help. Those are the kind of things where the voice is going to happen.
This is where if you match the voice with the AR, so you've got an AR glasses on.
Yeah,
I've seen this in production line for building cars and things like that, where the process of putting together parts to manufacture or compile a set of components together to make a product is driven by the AR and all the AI technology behind that. But having the addition of voice, which would say, rather than taking my hands off to go and type in something, I'm saying, I can't find the flathead screw for the back of the product. So I could pick up my communication to it, and then it would solve the problem for me without me taking my hands off the product.
Yeah. For those applicants, and there's training is another big one. So where training is expensive, like for surgeons, where this marriage of AR and voice is going to be an absolute breakthrough.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so interesting. So a bit of a blue sky going forward. Where do you see this industry in 5 years' time? I'm putting you on the line here.
Yeah, well, I think in retrospect, it'll be like mobile, right? In 2008, 2009, people said, oh, mobile's interesting. Do I need an app or do I not need an app? Like, what does it mean? 5 years later, mobile was the dominant way in which we interfaced with the internet, right? It's 70 or 80% of internet usage is by mobile devices. Voice is going to be the same thing, right? In 5 years, 70 or 80% of our interactions with devices are going to be voice first. Multimodal still, but voice first. It will still be screens because that's how we want to receive the information. But we're going to be telling machines what to do or telling machines the information versus using keyboards and mice and swiping and tapping. And I think the implications of that are just as important as with mobile or the internet itself, especially when married with Gen AI. So I think the next 5 years are going to be a big leap forward, just like 2009 to 2012 were. It's super exciting.
Fantastic. Tobias, this has been a very interesting and wonderful hour. I wish I could carry on talking to you. But
I'll come to Lisbon. We'll have a beer.
Perfect. Looking forward to that. But how do people engage with you? So tell us a little bit how people can get in touch with WillowTree.
Yeah. So obviously on LinkedIn, I have a unique name, Tobias Dengel. So easy to find there, or send me an email at tobias.dengel@willowtreeapps.com. You can also go to our website and find us there, or find us on LinkedIn. I think those are the easiest ways to get to us. And, our book is coming out in mid-October. So hopefully many of the listeners will be interested and pick the book up as it hits the shelves.
I must read The Sound of the Future, The Coming Age of Voice Technology. Tobias Dengel, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Hilton. Really appreciate it. Loved it.
Thank you for viewing and engaging with today's podcast. If you're interested in knowing more about citiesabc.com with openbusinesscouncil.org, go to our platforms, as well as you can also find me on social media and direct message me, Hilton Super, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And do go to the other interviews we have done on YouTube. And don't forget to like and comment. So thank you very much for your time and engaging with this interview today on Cities ABC.